January 24, 1942, Narsarsuaq, southwest Greenland. The C-47 transport pilot banks hard over Tunaliarfik Fjord, searching for something that shouldn't exist. Below him, jagged mountains rise 3,000 feet from the ice. The temperature outside his cockpit reads minus 28 degrees Fahrenheit. His fuel gauges are dropping into the red zone. Behind him, the North Atlantic stretches 2,000 miles back to Newfoundland. Ahead, another 1,000 miles of empty ocean separates him from Iceland. He has no choice but to find it. Then, impossibly, he sees it, a strip of metal, gleaming steel planks laid across a glacial plain at the head of the fjord. 5,000 feet of interlocking steel matting that had never been tested in such conditions, where 6 months ago there was nothing but granite and ice. The runway reflects the pale Arctic sun like a river of silver. Around it, dozens of wooden buildings cluster against the snow. Smoke rises from chimneys. This is Bluie West One, America's first Arctic airfield, a secret base that will become the single most critical link in ferrying aircraft to Europe. The pilot lines up his approach, flying low through the fjord's narrow throat. Mountains tower on both sides. Wind gusts batter his wings. The steel runway rushes up to meet him. His wheels touch down with a metallic shriek. The perforated steel planks, each one 10 feet long, 15 inches wide, punch through with dozens of holes, grip his tires, and hold. He's made it. He's alive. Behind him, thousands more will follow. What the pilot cannot know, what none of them can know, is that the runway beneath his aircraft represents one of the most audacious engineering achievements of the entire war. To build it, American engineers battled sub-zero temperatures, hurricane-force winds, and the constant threat of German U-boats prowling the Atlantic approaches. They blasted through ancient granite with tons of dynamite. They laid revolutionary steel matting that had never been tested in such conditions. They constructed an entire base in a location so remote that supplies arrived only by ship through treacherous waters, and they did it all in the span of 7 months. The runway at Bluie West One would become the vital stepping stone that allowed short-range fighters and medium bombers to reach the European theater. Without it, thousands of aircraft, P-38 Lightnings, B-25 Mitchells, B-17 Flying Fortresses, could never have made the journey across the Atlantic. The aircraft lacked the range to fly direct. They needed this frozen way station, this impossible Arctic outpost, to refuel and continue their mission. The story of how American engineers transformed a desolate Greenlandic fjord into a strategic air hub reveals a truth often overlooked in histories of the Second World War. If you're enjoying this story and believe these forgotten achievements deserve to be remembered, please hit that like button to help us bring more of them to light. Subscribe for more. This truth that logistics won the war as surely as any battle began here, in a place the Germans never even knew existed. The journey to this achievement had begun 18 months earlier when Nazi Germany invaded Denmark on April 9, 1940. With Denmark under occupation, its colony of Greenland, the world's largest island, suddenly found itself cut off from Copenhagen. The island's 2 governors, responsible for approximately 18,000 Greenlanders and a handful of Danish officials, faced an impossible situation. Germany controlled their mother country, Britain controlled the seas, and Greenland sat isolated in the North Atlantic, strategically positioned between North America and Europe. President Franklin Roosevelt understood immediately what Greenland represented. The island's location made it invaluable for weather forecasting. Most of Europe's weather patterns originated over Greenland's ice sheet. Its cryolite mine at Ivitut, near the southern tip, provided the only commercial source of a mineral essential for aluminum production in aircraft manufacturing. And its position made it a potential stepping stone for any power seeking to threaten North America. More importantly, Greenland offered a solution to an emerging military problem. With the passage of the Lend-Lease Act in March 1941, thousands of American-built aircraft needed to reach Britain to replace losses suffered during the Battle of Britain and the Blitz. But most fighters had ranges of only 400 to 600 miles. Medium bombers could manage perhaps 1,500 miles fully fueled. The Atlantic stretched 2,000 miles from Newfoundland to Iceland and another 800 miles from Iceland to Scotland. The mathematics were brutally simple. Short-range aircraft couldn't cross the ocean in a single hop. They needed intermediate airfields, a chain of bases where they could land, refuel, and continue. Greenland, positioned almost exactly halfway between Newfoundland and Iceland, was the obvious answer. But first, the United States needed legal authority to operate there. On April 9, 1941, exactly 1 year after Germany invaded Denmark, Danish Minister Henrik Kaufmann signed an agreement with Secretary of State Cordell Hull in Washington. The agreement relating to the defense of Greenland explicitly recognized Danish sovereignty while granting the United States the right to construct airfields and military facilities on the island. Kaufmann signed despite having no authorization from the German-occupied government in Copenhagen. The government in Denmark immediately recalled him and declared the agreement void. Kaufmann refused to comply, arguing that he represented the interests of the King of Denmark as sovereign of Greenland, not the puppet government under Nazi occupation. The agreement gave American forces legal cover to begin construction immediately. Within weeks, the U.S. Coast Guard cutter Cayuga departed Boston on March 17, 1941, carrying the South Greenland Survey Expedition. The mission: identify suitable sites for airfields along Greenland's southern coast. The expedition included Army and Navy personnel, military engineers, geologists, and meteorologists. Over the following weeks, they evaluated terrain that could accommodate runways, flat areas near navigable waters with approaches not hemmed in by mountains. They identified 13 potential sites. The most promising lay at Narsarsuaq, at the head of Tunuljarvik Fjord in southwest Greenland. The site offered a large glacial plain with drainage to the fjord. Mountains surrounded it on 3 sides, providing natural protection from the worst North Atlantic storms. The fjord itself, though treacherous to navigate, meant supplies could be delivered by ship, and the location placed it on the Great Circle route from North America to Europe. The site had one critical advantage the surveyors couldn't have predicted. Tucked deep inside the fjord, invisible from the open ocean, it would be nearly impossible for German long-range reconnaissance to locate. The Germans knew Greenland existed. They didn't know America was building an airfield there. On July 7, 1941, the 3rd Battalion of the 21st Engineer Aviation Regiment, commanded by Major Edward Walters, arrived aboard the transport ship Memargo. The convoy navigated carefully up to Tunuljarvik Fjord, a narrow passage flanked by steep cliffs and subject to unpredictable currents. When they reached the glacial plain at Narsarsuaq, the troops transferred to whaleboats and landed on a gravel beach. What greeted them was an empty wasteland. No infrastructure, no buildings, no runway, just a vast expanse of granite and permafrost surrounded by ice-covered mountains that blocked out the sun for much of the day. The ground was frozen solid. The temperature hovered near freezing even in summer. They had less than 6 months before the Arctic winter would shut down operations entirely. The 3rd Battalion numbered only 665 officers and men at the time. They were augmented with additional equipment from their regiment and civilian contractors from a New Orleans dredging company who arrived in September to build a wharf. Many of the troops came from southwestern Pennsylvania, coal country, and were professional soldiers accustomed to hardship. They would need every ounce of that toughness. Their mission was clear: construct a 5,000-foot runway, build facilities to house 4,000 personnel, and have the base operational before winter made further construction impossible. They had to do it while fighting the worst environmental conditions any American engineering unit had yet faced, and they had to do it in secrecy, vulnerable to German U-boat attack every time a supply ship attempted the voyage from North America. The race against the Arctic winter had begun. The construction of Bluie West One followed a brutal pattern: blast, grade, build, then watch the weather destroy what you'd built and start again. The engineers began with dynamite, tons of it. The runway site at Narsarsuaq sat on ancient granite overlaid with permafrost. Before they could lay any runway surface, they had to level the ground. Boulders the size of automobiles dotted the glacial plain. Bedrock protruded through the thin soil. In warmer climates, engineers might use jackhammers and bulldozers. Here, in sub-zero temperatures, such equipment struggled to function. Hydraulic fluid froze, diesel fuel gelled, metal became brittle and shattered under stress, so they blasted. Day after day, controlled explosions echoed through the fjord. The engineers would drill holes, pack them with dynamite, and detonate. Then bulldozers would push the rubble aside. Then they'd blast again. Slowly, painstakingly, the runway began to take shape. By September 1941, they erected approximately 85 wooden buildings. These were prefabricated structures, shipped in pieces and assembled on site. A wharf extended into the fjord, allowing supply ships to unload directly. Military strength reached 665 officers and men. The base began to resemble something more than a construction camp. Buildings housed troops, stored supplies, and provided workshops for maintaining equipment. Then August brought a windstorm that nearly destroyed everything. The Greenland ice sheet generates its own weather. Cold air forms over the ice cap, becomes denser than the warmer air around it, and begins to flow downhill under gravity. These are katabatic winds, gravity winds, and they can reach catastrophic speeds when channeled through coastal valleys. The meteorological detachment at Bluie West One estimated that gusts during the August 1941 storm reached 170 miles per hour. At such speeds, wind becomes a solid force. Tents that hadn't yet been replaced with wooden structures were ripped from their anchors and flung across the plain. Large steel fuel tanks weighing hundreds of pounds empty were picked up and hurled like toys. Equipment not properly secured vanished into the fjord or was smashed against the mountains. Men caught outside risked being blown off their feet. The noise was overwhelming, a constant roar that made communication impossible. The storm passed, but it delivered a harsh lesson. Anything not anchored with absolute certainty would be destroyed. The engineers began securing everything with multiple tie-downs. They weighted buildings with additional ballast. They learned to predict when storms were coming by watching for changes in wind direction and sudden clearing of clouds, and they continued working. As autumn approached and daylight dwindled to 3 or 4 hours per day, work on the runway continued under floodlights. The engineers had solved the problem of leveling the ground. Now they faced the problem of what to put on top of it. A traditional paved runway was impossible. The construction season was too short, concrete wouldn't cure properly in freezing temperatures, and the permafrost would cause heaving and cracking. A gravel runway might work in summer, but would become unusable when covered with ice and snow. The solution came from the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. Pierced steel planking, also known as Marston Mat. Each plank measured 10 feet long by 15 inches wide, made of pressed steel with a pattern of holes punched through it. The holes reduced weight while maintaining strength and allowed drainage. Hooks along one long edge interlocked with slots along the other edge, allowing planks to be connected. The short edges were cut straight. To achieve lengthwise interlocking, the mats were laid in a staggered pattern, like bricks. A single plank weighed 66 pounds. Building a 5,000-foot runway, 200 feet wide, required thousands of planks. Each one had to be carried to the site, positioned precisely, and interlocked with its neighbors. In freezing temperatures, wearing heavy gloves, engineers connected plank after plank after plank. The system had been tested at Langley Field, Virginia in 1940 and 1941, but never in Arctic conditions. No one knew if it would hold under heavy aircraft loads at -30 degrees. No one knew if ice accumulation would make it unusable. No one knew if the thermal expansion and contraction would crack the steel or break the interlocking connections. They were about to find out. By late December 1941, the runway was nearly complete. The Japanese had attacked Pearl Harbor on December 7th. America was at war. The need for aircraft in Europe had become urgent. The runway had to work. January 24, 1942, the first aircraft touched down on Bluie West One's steel runway. The moment represented a turning point not just for the base, but for the entire North Atlantic air ferry route. Until that day, ferrying aircraft to Britain was a hazardous, inefficient process. Larger bombers, B-17 Flying Fortresses, B-24 Liberators, could make the journey with auxiliary fuel tanks, but even they pushed the limits of their range. Fighters were largely impossible to ferry by air and had to be shipped, partially disassembled, in the holds of cargo vessels. This process took weeks, exposed the aircraft to U-boat attack, and often resulted in damage during loading and unloading that required additional repair time after arrival. Bluie West One changed everything. With the base operational, short-range aircraft could now follow the North Atlantic route, Presque Isle Army Airfield in northern Maine to Goose Bay and Labrador, Goose Bay to Bluie West One in Greenland, Bluie West One to Reykjavik or Keflavik in Iceland, and Iceland to Prestwick Airport in Scotland. No leg exceeded 850 miles. Fighters with ranges of 600 miles could make it with auxiliary belly tanks. Medium bombers had comfortable margins. Even damaged or aging aircraft that couldn't manage a direct ocean crossing could reach Europe via the stepping stone route. The steel mat runway performed beyond expectations. Engineers discovered that the perforated planks provided excellent traction even when covered with ice. The holes and corrugations gave aircraft tires something to grip. Snow fell through the holes rather than accumulating on the surface, reducing the need for constant clearing. The interlocking design distributed loads across multiple planks, preventing individual failures from making the runway unusable. And when a plank did fail, cracked by cold or damaged by heavy aircraft, it could be removed and replaced in minutes by two men with pry bars. The base expanded rapidly. By November 1942, military strength had grown from 665 to over 1,400 troops. By 1943, at peak operation, approximately 4,000 American servicemen were stationed at Bluie West One. The facility included hangars for maintenance, fuel storage tanks, communications equipment, weather stations, a 60-bed hospital that later expanded to 188 beds, and living quarters insulated against the Arctic cold. The hospital proved essential. Aircraft crashes were common. Weather in the North Atlantic was notoriously unpredictable. Navigation relied on celestial methods that clouds could render useless, and mechanical failures in the extreme cold were frequent. When aircraft went down on the Greenland ice cap or in the surrounding waters, rescue missions launched from Bluie West One. The base became a hub for search and rescue operations, launching numerous aircraft to locate and retrieve downed airmen. Notable efforts included an extensive 1942 operation for a crashed C-53 Sky Trooper that involved 16 planes from the base and highlighted the dangers of ice cap recoveries. But the base's primary mission remained clear: ferry as many aircraft as possible to the European theater. The numbers tell the story. In 1942, approximately 900 aircraft were ferried through the North Atlantic bases to active combat theaters. In 1943, that number jumped to approximately 3,200. In 1944, over 8,400 aircraft made the journey. In the first 5 months of 1945, before Germany's surrender, approximately 2,150 more crossed. In total, nearly 15,000 aircraft were ferried through the North Atlantic route during the war. And every single-engine fighter, every medium bomber that couldn't carry enough fuel for a direct crossing, passed through Bluie West One. The base recorded approximately 10,000 landings between 1942 and 1945. Some sources estimate the number may have been higher. Record-keeping in the harsh conditions was imperfect, and some aircraft made multiple stops during bad weather. The types of aircraft varied enormously. P-38 Lightnings with their distinctive twin-boom design became regular visitors. These fighters had slightly better range than most and were desperately needed in North Africa and later in Europe. P-39 Airacobras, though less successful in combat, still needed ferrying. P-47 Thunderbolts, massive single-engine fighters, could make the journey with drop tanks. B-25 Mitchell medium bombers stopped regularly. B-17 Flying Fortresses, though capable of flying more direct routes, often chose the northern route when weather made it safer. Transport aircraft, C-47 Skytrains, C-54 Skymasters became workhorses of the route, carrying not just themselves, but also passengers, mail, medical supplies, and critical cargo. The crews who flew these routes faced extraordinary challenges. Many were young pilots, fresh from training with minimal experience in long-distance navigation or Arctic flying. They relied on radio beacons when weather permitted and celestial navigation when it didn't. Cloud cover could render both useless. Magnetic compasses behaved erratically near the Arctic Circle. Ice accumulated on wings faster than anti-icing systems could handle it. Engine failures in the frigid air could be catastrophic. Gliding distance over the Greenland ice sheet or the North Atlantic meant certain death if rescue couldn't reach you quickly. The loss rates reflected these dangers. In 1942, approximately 4.12% of all aircraft that entered the North Atlantic wing for overseas movement was wrecked or otherwise lost. That meant roughly 1 in every 25 aircraft didn't make it. Crews were killed in crashes, lost to exposure when forced down on the ice, or simply vanished over the ocean without trace. During the winter of 1942-43, when weather was particularly severe, Air Transport Command suspended passenger transportation across the North Atlantic entirely. Some ferrying continued, but the route was partially closed, with traffic diverted to the longer South Atlantic route through Brazil and North Africa. But the engineers at Bluie West One kept the base operational. They kept the runway clear. They kept the fuel flowing. They kept the maintenance hangars functioning despite temperatures that dropped to 40 below zero. They did this knowing that German U-boats patrolled the waters through which their supply ships had to pass. They did this knowing that a single well-placed bomb from a German long-range reconnaissance aircraft, if one ever found them, could destroy the base entirely. The Germans never came. Whether through incredible operational security, sheer luck, or the base's remote location tucked deep in a Greenlandic fjord, Bluie West One remained unknown to enemy forces throughout the war. To the Luftwaffe and the Kriegsmarine, Greenland was a vast, empty wasteland. They knew the Allies operated weather stations there. They didn't realize America had built a complete air base capable of supporting thousands of aircraft. That ignorance proved costly. Every fighter that passed through Bluie West One eventually reached Europe. Every bomber that refueled there went on to strike German targets. The base that shouldn't exist became the vital link that enabled American air power to reach the European theater in decisive numbers. And it all rested on a foundation of perforated steel laid across frozen granite in one of the most inhospitable places on Earth. The success of Bluie West One rested on a revolutionary technology: pierced steel planking, more commonly known as Marston Mat. The development of this material began in 1939 when the United States Army Air Corps started exploring runway construction for unimproved airfields. The challenge was clear. Military operations might require airfields in locations where traditional paved runways were impossible to build. Jungle environments, Pacific Islands, Arctic tundra, all demanded rapid runway construction using materials that could be transported easily and assembled quickly. The British and French had already developed solutions. British runway mat resembled heavy-duty chicken wire shipped in huge rolls weighing tons. It worked reasonably well for light aircraft but was difficult to handle and seemed inadequate for medium bombers. The French used a heavy steel chevron gridwork similar to bridge decking, but each section weighed over 100 pounds and installation was complex. The Air Corps needed something better. Something that could handle fighters weighing 7,000 pounds and heavy bombers like the B-17 Flying Fortress weighing 55,000 pounds. The solution came from Gerald G. Grulich of Carnegie, Illinois Steel Company, working with the Army Corps of Engineers. They designed pressed steel planks with U-shaped channels running lengthwise for strength. Along one long edge, hooks were formed in the steel. Along the other edge, slots were cut. Adjacent mats could be connected by fitting hooks into slots, creating an interlocking surface. Initially, the planks were solid steel, but during the winter of 1940-41, engineers realized a solid surface was unnecessary. They began punching holes along the channels, 3 holes wide by 29 holes long, resulting in 87 holes per mat. This reduced weight by 17.5% without significantly reducing strength. The hole pattern also provided drainage and created a non-skid surface. The final design weighed 66 pounds per plank. Each plank measured 10 feet long by 15 inches wide. The steel contained high manganese content, making it highly resistant to corrosion. The holes were pressed, not drilled, which work-hardened the steel around each opening and increased local strength. The system was first tested at Camp Mackle Airfield near Marston, North Carolina in November 1941. A temporary runway, 150 feet by 3,000 feet, was constructed in days. When the maneuvers ended, the runway was dismantled, loaded into 18 railroad gondola cars, and hauled away. The material entered Army vernacular as Marston Mat. The mathematics of deployment were straightforward. Packed for shipping, the mat for a 5,000-foot runway weighed 1,986 tons and occupied 41,600 cubic feet. This could fit into multiple Liberty ships, with the high-density runway mat loaded into lower holds and lighter cargoes stacked on top. For Bluie West One, the planks were shipped from the United States, transported across the Atlantic through U-boat-infested waters, offloaded at the wharf, and carried across the construction site. In sub-zero temperatures, engineers wearing heavy gloves connected plank after plank. The hooks and slots had to align perfectly. Any gap or misalignment could catch aircraft wheels and cause accidents. A runway 200 feet wide and 5,000 feet long could be created within 2 days by a small team in ideal conditions. At Bluie West One, in Arctic conditions, with temperatures well below zero and frequent storms, construction took months. But once completed, the runway provided capabilities impossible with any other technology. The perforated design proved ideal for Arctic operations. Snow fell through the holes rather than accumulating on the surface. Water drained away instead of pooling and freezing. The holes and corrugations provided traction even when the steel was coated with frost. And because each plank interlocked with multiple neighbors, the load from aircraft wheels was distributed across a large area, preventing individual plank failures. The system was designed for easy repair. Engineers installed alternate courses with hooks pointed in opposite directions. When a mat failed, cracked by thermal stress or damaged by heavy aircraft, 2 men with pry bars could remove it and install a replacement in minutes. The innovation represented a fundamental shift in military engineering philosophy. Rather than adapting operations to existing infrastructure, American engineers were building infrastructure to match operational needs. Need an airfield in the Arctic? Lay steel mat. Need an airfield on a Pacific island? Lay steel mat. Large quantities were produced during the war, approximately 2 million tons, costing more than $200 million in 1940s dollars. It was extensively used by Army engineers and Navy Seabees to build runways across all theaters. After the success at Bluie West One, PSP became standard equipment in the Pacific. A C-47 Skytrain became the first plane to land on the first steel mat runway constructed in France after D-Day. At war's end, enormous quantities remained as surplus. Because of its corrosion resistance, the material was used in civil engineering, road construction, bridge building, fencing. In the Philippines and Papua New Guinea, the matting remains in use today. But it all began at Bluie West One, where American engineers gambled that an unproven technology could turn frozen wasteland into functional runway. The gamble succeeded beyond expectations. The operational success of Bluie West One extended far beyond simply providing a refueling stop. The base became a complex hub of military operations that saved countless lives and enabled missions impossible without it. Search and rescue operations became one of the base's most critical secondary missions. The North Atlantic air route was extraordinarily dangerous. Weather could change in minutes, turning clear skies into zero-visibility whiteouts. When aircraft went down, and they did regularly, search and rescue teams launched from Bluie West One. The most famous rescue operation involved the B-17 Flying Fortress My Gal Sal. The bomber crashed on the Greenland ice cap in November 1942, with its crew surviving the impact. Search aircraft from multiple bases, including Bluie West One, participated in the recovery operation. The crew was eventually rescued, but multiple rescue aircraft also crashed during the operation, requiring additional rescues. The missions continued despite the risks because leaving men on the ice cap meant certain death from exposure. The base also operated extensive weather reporting stations. Most European weather patterns originated over Greenland and the North Atlantic. By monitoring conditions at Bluie West One and at other Greenland stations, meteorologists could provide advance warning of storm systems moving toward Europe. This information proved invaluable for planning bomber missions and amphibious operations. Transport operations ran through the base continuously. By 1943, aircraft ferrying wasn't limited to moving empty fighters and bombers. Transport aircraft carried passengers, mail, medical supplies, and critical cargo. High-priority passengers, senior officers, technical specialists, urgently needed replacements flew the North Atlantic route. The expanded hospital facilities reflected the base's growing importance. Originally a 10-bed tent hospital established in August 1941, it expanded to a 60-bed cantonment by January 1943 and culminated in the opening of the 188th Station Hospital in December 1943, equipped with 250 beds. Following the sinking of the USAT Dorchester in February 1943, when a German torpedo struck the transport ship carrying 902 men, killing 672, survivors were brought to Bluie West One for treatment. The logistics of keeping the base operational were staggering. Everything had to be shipped from the United States or Canada through waters prowled by German U-boats. The U.S. Coast Guard cutter Algonquin, armed with weapons capable of challenging any U-boat, provided protection for incoming supply ships. Fuel logistics presented enormous challenges. Aircraft burned thousands of gallons of aviation fuel daily. The fuel had to be stored in tanks protected from the cold, pumped through lines that wouldn't freeze, and delivered to aircraft in conditions that made standard refueling procedures difficult. Engineers developed systems to keep fuel flowing even in temperatures that would gel diesel and freeze hydraulic fluids. The workforce at peak operation, approximately 4,000 military personnel, required housing, feeding, and support services. In an environment where temperatures could drop to -40 degrees and daylight disappeared entirely for weeks during winter, maintaining morale was as important as maintaining equipment. Regular rotation schedules prevented personnel from spending more than a year in the harsh conditions. Aircraft maintenance presented unique challenges. At Bluie West One, mechanics worked in conditions that made wrenches brittle, froze hydraulic systems, and made it dangerous to touch bare metal with exposed skin. Heated hangars provided some protection, but much work happened outdoors, where mechanics developed specialized techniques for Arctic maintenance. The base's importance to the overall war effort became clear from the statistics. Of the nearly 15,000 aircraft ferried through North Atlantic bases between 1942 and 1945, the majority of single-engine fighters and many medium bombers passed through Bluie West One. Without the base, these aircraft would have required shipment by sea, a much slower process that exposed them to U-boat attack. The improved loss rates demonstrated the route's increasing safety. In 1942, approximately 4.12% of aircraft entering the North Atlantic wing was wrecked or lost. During the first 10.5 months of 1943, the loss ratio dropped to 1.14%. Better weather forecasting, improved navigational techniques, more experienced crews, and the reliability of bases like Bluie West One all contributed to the improvement. Major General Carl Spaatz, commanding the 8th Air Force, used Bluie West One as a communications hub while crossing the Atlantic in mid-June 1942. From there, he radioed orders that began the movement of P-38 and P-39 fighters escorted by longer-range B-17 bombers to Britain. The operation demonstrated that the North Atlantic route could handle organized mass movements. By 1944, as the Allied invasion of Europe approached, the pace of aircraft ferrying intensified. More than 8,400 aircraft crossed the North Atlantic that year, the highest total of the war. Bluie West One operated at maximum capacity, with aircraft landing, refueling, and departing in an almost continuous flow during good weather. And through it all, the steel runway held. Month after month, year after year, thousands of aircraft touched down and took off from the same perforated planks laid in late 1941. The technology proved its worth beyond any doubt. The complete statistical record of Bluie West One reveals the true scope of its contribution to Allied victory. Approximately 10,000 aircraft landed at the base between January 1942 and May 1945. This number includes the full range of aircraft types that passed through: P-38 Lightning fighters with their distinctive twin booms, P-39 Airacobra fighters, P-47 Thunderbolt fighters, P-51 Mustang fighters in later years, B-25 Mitchell medium bombers, B-17 Flying Fortress heavy bombers using the northern route as safer than direct crossings, B-24 Liberator heavy bombers, C-47 Skytrain transport aircraft, C-54 Skymaster transport aircraft, and numerous other specialized types. The base reached its peak staffing in 1943 with approximately 4,000 U.S. military personnel. This number fluctuated with the seasons, higher during summer when construction and operations were easier, lower during the worst winter months when some activities were curtailed. The total number of American servicemen who served at Bluie West One throughout the war likely exceeded 10,000 given normal rotation schedules and transfers. The runway itself, constructed with innovative pierced steel planking, measured 5,000 feet long by 200 feet wide initially. It was later expanded, and by the end of the war had been extended and improved multiple times as operational requirements evolved. The steel mat runway, one of the first operational uses of the technology, proved that PSP could function reliably in Arctic conditions, a lesson that would be applied to hundreds of other airfield constructions throughout all theaters of the war. The base operated continuously from January 1942 through the end of the war in Europe in May 1945. During the winter months of 1942-43, when weather was particularly severe and loss rates climbed, the base reduced operations but never closed entirely. Some aircraft continued to use the route throughout the winter, though the majority of ferry traffic was concentrated in better weather months. Infrastructure at peak development included approximately 85 wooden buildings constructed during the initial phase, expanded to well over 100 structures by 1943. These included hangars, storage facilities, living quarters, administrative buildings, a 250-bed hospital, communication centers, weather stations, fuel storage, workshops, and recreational facilities. A wharf extending into Tunnel-Jarvik Fjord allowed direct offloading from supply ships. The base represented a significant financial investment, though exact costs are difficult to determine from available records. The steel matting alone, thousands of planks at 66 pounds each, represented hundreds of tons of specially manufactured steel. Construction equipment, buildings, fuel storage, and all other infrastructure required shipping across the Atlantic and installation in extreme conditions. The ongoing operational costs, fuel, supplies, personnel, maintenance, continued throughout the war. After the war ended, Bluie West One's importance declined, but the base didn't close immediately. During the early Cold War years, it was maintained as Narsar-Suwalk Air Base, serving as a refueling station for jet fighters and helicopters crossing the North Atlantic. The runway was eventually paved with concrete to handle heavier jet aircraft. In 1958, the base was turned over to the Danish government of Greenland. Today, it operates as Narsar-Suwalk Airport, still serving regular flights and maintaining its role as one of southern Greenland's primary airports. The story of Bluie West One contains a truth that military historians often overlook. Wars are won as much by logistics and engineering as by combat operations. Every P-38 Lightning that fought over Europe began its journey on a steel runway in an Arctic fjord. Every B-25 Mitchell that couldn't carry enough fuel to cross the Atlantic directly stopped at Bluie West One to refuel. Every fighter pilot who survived the war because his aircraft reached Britain in time owed part of that survival to engineers who built a runway where no runway should exist. The Germans never discovered the base. This fact alone represents one of the most successful operational security achievements of the war. German U-boats patrolled the North Atlantic. German long-range reconnaissance aircraft flew periodic missions over Iceland. German intelligence knew the Allies were ferrying aircraft to Britain and suspected intermediate bases must exist. They never found Bluie West One. Perhaps the base's location, tucked deep inside Tunelirfik Fjord, surrounded by mountains, invisible from the open ocean, provided natural concealment. Perhaps the harsh conditions discouraged reconnaissance efforts. Perhaps Allied operational security was simply effective. Most likely, all three factors combined to keep America's Arctic runway secret. The contrast between American and Axis logistics philosophy appears starkly in this story. Germany and Japan focused tremendous resources on developing advanced weapons and tactics. America focused equally on logistics, the unglamorous work of building supply chains, establishing bases, moving materials across oceans. Bluie West One exemplifies this philosophy. It wasn't a weapon, it wasn't a tactic, it was infrastructure that enabled thousands of weapons to reach the theater where they could be used. The engineers who built Bluie West One weren't celebrated heroes. They didn't shoot down enemy aircraft or capture territory. They blasted granite in sub-zero temperatures. They laid steel planks in howling winds. They maintained fuel systems when touching metal with bare skin meant instant frostbite. They kept the runway operational through Arctic storms. Their contribution was as essential as any battle fought in the war. The technology they proved, pierced steel planking, revolutionized military airfield construction, and remained in use through the Korean War, the Vietnam War, and even recent conflicts. The lessons learned about Arctic construction informed Cold War operations in Greenland. The operational procedures developed for managing high-volume aircraft movements became standard for military aviation logistics, but most importantly, Bluie West One demonstrated a principle that would define American military power for the next 80 years. The ability to project force globally depends absolutely on logistics infrastructure. Wars are fought with bullets and bombs, but they're won with supply chains, fuel depots, maintenance facilities, and runways. A secret highway of steel blasted from granite and ice became one of the most crucial Allied assets of World War II. Not through firepower, not through tactical innovation, but through the patient work of engineers who built what was needed, where it was needed, regardless of how impossible the task appeared. That runway carried more than aircraft. It carried the lesson that logistics infrastructure determines what's militarily possible. And in that single lesson lies a complete explanation of how America helped win the Second World War.